Hello, Winsong family. I just wanted to share with you a little bit about something coming up. I'm going to be starting this Wednesday evening a series through Ephesians. And so what I want to do right now is take a few moments and share with you a little bit of an introduction to the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus. Now, there is some questions regarding the authorship of Ephesians, but we see Paul's name at the very beginning of this letter. And so some of the reasons that people would think that this was not written by Paul is that the style is a little bit different from his other writings, especially writings like 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans and the letter to the church in Galatia. But there are some similarities to other writings that Paul had, particularly with Colossians, and the amount of repetition that we see within the text, very similar to that of the letter written to the church in Colossae. Now, as far as external evidence for Paul being the author of this letter, it was accepted widely among early Christians, especially in the 2nd century, as being written by Paul. And it's not seriously doubted until modern times, really, by scholars. Most scholars believe, in fact, that this is a letter that's written by Paul. Now, there are some internal evidence that we see within the letter itself. First of all, like I said a minute ago, Paul begins writing by sharing his name in verse 1. And it's the usual pattern that Paul writes in with regard to the prayers, the repetition. We can see kind of his style coming out in this writing. We see the words and the expressions that are common to Paul's writing in other places. And really, much of really the first 3 chapters that deal a lot with doctrine and theology, you can see this being very much Paul's theology. And so I would say, as I'm sure most of you are not real concerned with, I would say that indeed this is a letter that was written by the Apostle Paul. Now, there are questions regarding who the letter was written to. Certainly our Bibles say the letter of Paul to the Ephesians. And yes, that indeed is in some of the manuscripts that we have preserved, but there are some differing views on it. Now, I want to share with you some of these views. Now, let's start with the one that I believe, and I think probably the one that you believe, that in fact this was written to the church in Ephesus. In an argument for this being written to them, it's the traditional view. It was held early within the church that that's who the letter was written to. Also, the phrase is in many of the manuscripts that we have preserved for us. And it's found in all ancient New Testament versions. And it's attributed to Paul as he is writing to the church in Ephesus. Now, there are people who argue against this, and primarily because of what we have preserved in the earliest manuscripts. The phrase "in Ephesus" at the very beginning is not found in the oldest and most valuable Greek manuscripts that we have. And so I like what one writer said. He said, "This includes P46, which dates to the beginning of the 3rd century and is the earliest manuscript that we have of this letter." Now, that's a strong argument to be made, yes, but early in the history of the church, there is wide acceptance that Paul had written this letter and that it was intended for the Christians in Ephesus. Now, granted, the church in Ephesus and maybe in the surrounding region would not have been what we think of in terms as a church, for instance, like Winsong Church of Christ. It wouldn't have been just one particular church, but rather probably the group of believers that are in the area around Ephesus. Now, some of the other writers that would argue against this letter being intended for the people in Ephesus is that there's a lack of personal greeting within this. So, for instance, the way that Paul in his other writings would say, greet Apollos or greet Erastus, all these names that Paul would mention and say to greet them. He doesn't do that in this particular letter. And kind of one of the strange things about the fact that he doesn't do that within this letter is that Paul had spent a great deal of time in Ephesus, and he would have known these people on a very personal level. He knew this congregation very well, and yet we find him saying things like, for instance, in chapter 1, verse 15, "For this reason, because I have heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love toward all the saints." Now, some would look at that and they would say, well, see, Paul hasn't really been there. He doesn't really know them, but he's just heard about them. And I could see how one might begin to make that argument. Also, there are no terms of endearment or references to the brethren. And you would think that maybe if Paul had intended for this letter to be written to the Christians that he had been around for so long, that especially that group of elders that met him at Miletus, and as Paul gave his farewell address to them and said, "You're never going to see my face again," and they all were weeping, you would think that he would at least mention something about them. And so you can see how some would argue that maybe this was not intended for them. Another theory that is put forward, not just that this is intended for the Ephesians, but rather maybe the Laodiceans. And this theory is based out of what we see in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 16, where there seems to be this hint of a lost epistle, that maybe there was some other writing that was out there that maybe somehow was lost, and some attribute that to what we know of as the letter to the Ephesians, and they say, well, this really should have been going or been delivered to the church in Laodicea. I don't know if that holds much weight, but it is a theory. The encyclical theory also is that it was written to more than one church. Now, this may be an argument of merit. You think about the lack of title, it would indicate maybe that it could be passed around in multiple locations and have the same effect. Also, there is no destination that's given in the best manuscript, so that might lend itself to this as well. Now, some arguments against this encyclical theory that the letter was intended for a larger group, more so than just one particular congregation. Some against it was that the later manuscripts do include in Ephesus, and Ephesians or Ephesus is the traditional view. And so that would go against the encyclical theory. Now, that being said, I don't have a problem with the idea that maybe this is intended for a large group of people, more so than just specifically the church in Ephesus. I think obviously the inspired Word of God, though the individual letters are intended for specific groups of people at a specific time, God has preserved His Word for us even today. And so certainly to suggest that maybe this was only intended for a certain group of people at a specific time, I'm not sure that we can necessarily say that. So I would be personally okay with saying the encyclical theory would be a worthy theory to hold, because I think, yes, there is evidence of the earliest manuscripts that did not include in Ephesus in the opening to indicate that that's who it was intended for. That was added later. And we know that from the other manuscripts that we have. So I just want to kind of give you that bit of background with this particular letter. Now, excuse me. The letter was written sometime between 60 and 62 A.D., and it was probably written from Rome during the first imprisonment of Paul. And I would kind of lean more toward this being near 62 than the 60 number. And so kind of think in terms of where the history of the first century is at this point. There's a lot of persecution that's going on, a lot of challenges that the Christians faced. The bearer of this letter is identified in chapter 6 and verse 21 as Tychicus. Think about the character of this letter. It's a general letter. It does have differences within it as far as the purpose and the tone and the style that the other writings of Paul would have. Notice this, it doesn't contain personal references to any local problem within the church, or references to Paul's work with them in previous years. And so that seems to be a bit odd about this letter. Also, this letter is very wordy. There's a natural division that we see from the first 3 chapters, which deal with the doctrinal issues. It deals with kind of who the church is, the purpose of the church, that kind of thing. That's the first 3 chapters. And then the latter 3 chapters, chapters 4 through 6, deal with the practical aspects of the doctrine that Paul has previously taught in this letter. So the letter does seem to be more of a general letter to Christians overall. Think about the theme of what we see in this letter to the Ephesians. Unity is a major theme in this letter. Also, the church is a major theme. And really, the sections that we see can be divided up, as I said a moment ago, into doctrinal and practical. It all deals with who we are as the people of God, as followers of Jesus, what God has done for us in Christ. And then Paul says, okay, here's how to live that out. So here's who we are, here's who God is, here's what God has done, and now this is the way you need to live it out. The city of Ephesus, so we've got to think about the history behind this letter. The city of Ephesus was a very famous and wealthy city. It was located where the Cayster River flowed into the Aegean Sea. And we see it being at the head, the city of Ephesus, at the head of its harbor, where the Cayster River flowed into the Aegean Sea, was something that became known or was thought of to be as one of the 7 wonders of the world. And it was the temple to the goddess Artemis. And this is the equivalent of the goddess of Diana. Diana would have been a Roman goddess. Artemis would have been a Greek goddess. And so that's the connection there. Now, Ephesus, the city of Ephesus, had great commercial importance. It was one of the greatest seaports in the ancient world. There were 3 great highways that intersected at Ephesus. One of those is the road from Euphrates Valley which came through Colossae and Laodicea. Another one was the road from Galatia, and the third one was the road from Meander Valley in the south. And these 3 major thoroughfares met in Ephesus. So you can imagine the economy and the trade that existed in first century Ephesus. Now, as far as archaeological remains, they're very sparse. There hasn't been a lot of things found, although 4 things that I want to mention. One is the arch that's over the Ignatian Way. It is there. There's the Roman amphitheater that is there. The main processional street is still there. Also, there are stones that are scattered from the temple in this swamp area, and so those have been located. And that's really the extent of any archaeological evidence that we have regarding the city of Ephesus. The city was also of great political importance. It was known as the supreme metropolis of Asia. Now, anytime you see in the New Testament where you read about Asia, or you think in terms of Ephesus being referred to as the supreme metropolis of Asia, it's not talking about the continent of Asia as we know it. It's talking about the region that we know of today as Turkey and that area of the world. So think in terms of that rather than the continent of Asia. Ephesus was a free city. That means that there was no Roman occupation troops that were there. It was an autonomous city. They had its own government. They had magistrates. They had elected governing councils. They had the assembly of citizens, and they had a town clerk. Now, the town clerk comes into the picture in chapter 19 when we see the riot breaking out. But the town clerk was responsible for keeping the archives, introducing business into the governing council. The town clerk would also handle the municipal correspondence, and he was also the one who witnessed the deposits of money that were made in the temple of Artemis. And so we see this being a very important political area in the first century. The Pan-Ionian Games were held in Ephesus in May, and this was every year. Now, interestingly enough, May is Artemision in Greek. And so Artemis, May is when they would hold these games, and you can see kind of the connection back to the Temple of Artemis. It's Artemision. May is Artemision in Greek. The Asiarchs that we read about in chapter 19, verse 31, they arranged and they paid for these Ionian games, the Pan-Ionian games. The Asiarchs were really wealthy, high-ranking city officials or government officials, the Asiarchs. And so we see them. Also, Ephesus was of great religious importance. As I said a moment ago, it was kind of the headquarters for worship of the goddess Artemis. And the temple of Artemis was there. And as I said, it was one of the 7 wonders of the world. But it's a very religious place. Even prior to Artemis and the worship of Artemis, it was a center of great superstition in the world. Occultism was deeply rooted in Ephesus. From earliest history, there had been a temple there. Now, we don't know who built the first temple, but the second temple was built by cities in Asia and Croesus. Also, the king of Lydda participated in this, and it was burned. Interestingly enough, the second temple was burned the night that Alexander the Great was born in 356 BC. Now, the third temple that I mentioned, this is the one that was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it was the temple of Artemis, or Diana in the Greek. 400 or Diana rather, in Roman goddesses. The temple of Artemis was 425 feet long, 220 feet wide, 60 feet tall, had a roof of cedar, had doors of cypress. It had 127 pillars. Each one was a gift from a king. There were 36 pillars that were overlaid with carvings and gold and jewels. Now, the image of Artemis was there, and again, she is the fertility goddess, the Greek fertility goddess. And she was said to have fallen from heaven. We see that in Acts chapter 19, verse 35, that she fell from heaven. Probably a meteorite, if I was guessing. Now, the significance of the temple of Artemis is that it was a place of worship, it was a place of asylum, it was a place of safekeeping. And when you read about it being a place of safekeeping, really what we're talking about there is the ancient world's banks. So when you read anything, if you do any research on Ephesus, you'll see that it was an area, at least the temple of Artemis was a place of safekeeping. And so this was like a bank. And it was a place of commerce. And so it was of great importance in this region. Now, the church in Ephesus, and that's really what we need to get to and think about. And I do want to briefly share this with you, and then I'll close for this particular session. The church in Ephesus was begun when Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla stopped at Ephesus on their way to Palestine from Corinth, and this would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of AD 53 and 54. When they were there, Paul debated the Jews in the synagogue. We see that in Acts 18, verses 18 through 21, and later the church appears to have been predominantly Gentile rather than Jewish. That would kind of explain Paul's interest in working with them and kind of where his focus was in his ministry, that he was the apostle to the Gentiles. And when Paul returned to Ephesus about 5 years later, he found a dozen disciples who had been, we might say, improperly baptized. I mean, they were baptized, but they only knew the baptism of John. And so in Acts 19, verses 1 through 5, we see Paul teaching them about the things they lacked and then baptizing each of them again. On his third missionary journey, Paul preached in the synagogue for 3 months, and then there was strong opposition that arose, and he taught 2 years then in the hall of Tyrannus. And we see that in Acts 19, verse 9. I think Paul took great importance, or saw great importance in his work that he did among the Christians in Ephesus, and it's indicated by the length of time that he spent there with them. And then we see a statement in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 8 and 9, where Paul says, "A great and effective door has been opened to me." And so he understood what great importance the work there was, and he was engaged in that and spent a great deal of time with the people in Ephesus. Well, the effect of the gospel is indicated by the fact that believers burned occult books worth 50,000 pieces of silver, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $12,000 today. And they did all of this at one time. That was a great deal of money. And we see this in Acts 19, verses 18 through 20. When Paul then went to Jerusalem for the last time, it was AD 58 or 60, somewhere around in that region, he asked the elders of the Ephesian church to meet him in Miletus. I mentioned this earlier. And so they came, and Paul cautioned them about events that would happen in the future, and also he told them farewell. They wept together. He told them, "You will probably never see my face again." And so they were very saddened as they were departing from one another. We see that in Acts chapter 20, verses 17 through 38. After he was released from the first imprisonment, Paul took Timothy to Ephesus, and he did so to oppose the false teaching that was going on, and really at the hands of Hymenaeus and Alexander. Also Philetus is mentioned there, and others as well. We see this in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 through 7, also verses 18 through 20. 30 years after the first letter was written to the Ephesian church, another was addressed to them as a part of the revelation. Now this is where we see Jesus telling John, the Apostle John, to write these things down. In Revelation 2, verses 1 through 7, this letter shares with us, or helps us to see what ended up happening within the church at Ephesus. And really, it helps us to know about the church's dedication and how maybe that commitment has waned through the years. And so Jesus is calling that church back to where they should be. Well, that's really kind of a brief introduction. I know I say brief, it's been 24 minutes now, but that's an introduction to this letter to the church in Ephesus. I want you to think about these things, and I would encourage you to do some reading, maybe do some research while you're sitting around. Just Google Ephesus and start reading some about the background of what took place there, some of the things that I mentioned, and there's a lot of other material that you can read through if you desire to do that. But also, I want to encourage you to read through chapter 1 of Ephesians. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday evening. So be looking for that video to come out Wednesday evening at about 6:30. I'll be posting that on our Facebook group and page, also on our website, and we'll be sending that out via email. So make sure to be looking for that on Wednesday. I hope you have a great week. Please continue to pray about our situation. Pray for our elders as they continue to make difficult decisions.